Welcome to my channel, The World of Science Fiction. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. The air in Titan's maw tasted of recycled metal and weary resignation. Kalen knew the flavor well. He had breathed it for 8 standard years, a penance self-imposed and officially sanctioned. He stood his post on the observation deck of Containment Sector Gamma, a silent figure in a gray warden's uniform, his face a mask of disciplined neutrality that concealed a landscape of old erosions. Below him, suspended in a shimmering column of amber light, floated Subject 734. The official designation was a cold, sterile thing, a label for a specimen. To the miners and the technicians, she was the ghost shard, the source of the crystalline energy that powered half the outer rim colonies for the Axiom Corporation. Kalen watched the light shift and swirl around the being within the stasis field. It was tall, impossibly slender, its form composed not of flesh and bone, but of something akin to solidified light, a humanoid silhouette of captive starlight. The Xylosian. His briefing slate had described them as feral, monstrous architects of a war that had scorched a dozen worlds a generation ago. But watching the slow, melancholic drift of light within the containment field, Kalen saw no monster. He saw only a profound and terrible loneliness. His job was simple: to watch, to report anomalies, and to ensure the energy siphon maintained its steady, parasitic draw. It was a quiet life, a purgatory for a man who had seen too much of hell to ever feel at home in peace. His past was a ghost that walked beside him in the silent, echoing corridors. Praetorian Guard, 1st Legion. The title was ash in his mouth. He remembered the fires of Cygnus X-1, the shudder of the deck plates as the orbital lances discharged, the orders he had followed without question. He had been a good soldier then. A good soldier did not ask why. He only asked who was next. Now, in the humming quiet of this asteroid prison, he had nothing but time to ask the questions he should have asked then. The answers never came. There was only the low thrum of the station's life support and the silent, shimmering presence of the captive below. A tremor ran through the deck plating, a low, guttural groan from the asteroid's ancient heart. The overhead lumens flickered once, twice, then dimmed to a blood-red emergency glow. On his console, a cascade of amber warnings appeared. Power fluctuation. Grid instability. Auxiliary systems failing. Kalen's hands moved with an old, ingrained economy, his fingers dancing across the touch-sensitive surface, running diagnostics. A critical feedback loop was building in the main reactor, a consequence of Axiom cutting corners on maintenance cycles for the 3rd time this fiscal year. He looked down at the containment field. The amber light was sputtering, its cohesion failing. For a split second, the field dissolved entirely. In that instant, Subject 734 was revealed not as a creature of abstract light, but as a being with a definite form, its crystalline limbs contorted in what looked like agony. A silent scream seemed to emanate from it, not a sound, but a wave of pure despair that washed over Kalen, cold and sharp as fractured glass. He felt it in the marrow of his bones, a sorrow so vast it felt ancient. The field snapped back into place, weaker this time, a flickering candle against a gale. Protocol was clear. In the event of a critical containment failure, the specimen was to be terminated. A single red icon pulsed on his console, labeled Purge 1 touch, and a focused plasma burst would incinerate the chamber, ending the threat, ending the specimen, ending the flicker of empathy he had felt. His duty was to the station, to the corporation, to the preservation of order. He had always followed orders. It was the principle upon which his entire life had been built. He looked at the pulsing red icon, and then at the struggling light in the chamber below. He saw the fires of Cygnus again, the silent, falling ash. He remembered the hollow feeling in his gut as he had watched a world die because a man in a clean, white uniform had given an order. His hand hovered over the console, his fingers trembling almost imperceptibly. He had been a good soldier. But he was not that man anymore. With a sharp, decisive movement, he bypassed the purge command. Instead, he shunted power from his own sector's life support, from the observation deck's lighting, from every non-essential system under his control, and rerouted it directly into the containment field's emitter array. The red emergency lights died, plunging his post into near-total darkness, illuminated only by the console's glow. The air grew thin, the recyclers groaning to a halt. Below, the amber field solidified, its light strengthening from a flicker to a steady, warm glow. The violent shuddering of the Xylosian's form ceased. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, a new sensation bloomed in his mind. It was not a thought, not a voice, but a feeling of immense, surprised gratitude. It was a touch of warmth against the cold iron of his soul. It was a connection, forged in an act of forbidden compassion. He had broken protocol. He had defied his orders. And in the sudden, profound silence of his darkened post, Kalen understood that his quiet purgatory had just come to a violent and irrevocable end. The klaxons were immediate, a brutal, shrieking violation of the station's oppressive quiet. Red light pulsed through the corridors now, painting the sterile gray walls in strokes of emergency. On his console, a new message flashed, stark and final: unauthorized power diversion. Containment protocol override. Lethal force engaged. A schematic of the sector appeared, showing armored security teams converging on his position from 3 directions. He knew Prefect Valerius. The man was a corporate creature down to his bones, a man who saw balance sheets where others saw lives. An anomaly was a risk to profits. A risk was to be excised without sentiment. Kalen had just made himself an anomaly, and he had made Subject 730 for a liability that Valerius would now seek to liquidate permanently. The thought of the Purge command he had ignored returned, and he knew Valerius would not hesitate. A voice, metallic and stripped of humanity, crackled from his console speaker. Warden Kalen, surrender your post immediately. Your access codes have been revoked. Comply, or you will be met with terminal force. It was Subprefect Thorn, a man whose ambition was as sharp and unpleasant as his neatly trimmed beard. Thorn had always looked at Kalen with a mixture of suspicion and contempt, seeing his quiet posting not as penance, but as a sign of weakness. Kalen didn't answer. He looked down at the stabilized containment field, at the calm, radiant being within. The warmth in his mind was still there, a fragile thread of connection. It was no longer just gratitude. Now it was laced with a palpable fear. She knew they were coming for her. He had saved her from a system failure only to deliver her to a firing squad. The bitter irony was not lost on him. He drew his sidearm, an old Praetorian issue slug pistol, heavy and obsolete in this age of plasma repeaters. It was a relic, a reminder of what he had been. Perhaps it was time it became more than a memory. He slammed his palm on the emergency release for the containment chamber's access lift. Another alarm screamed, a higher, more insistent pitch. The lift was meant for maintenance drones, a cramped cage of steel mesh, but it was his only way down. As it descended, he could hear the percussive thud of mag boots on the deck above. Thorn's team had arrived. The lift doors hissed open into the sterile, circular chamber. The air here was thick with the smell of ozone and charged particles. The low hum of the stasis field a physical pressure against his skin. The Xylosian turned its head of light toward him. The feeling in his mind sharpened, a clear query of confusion and fear. Why was he here? Was he the executioner? "I'm getting you out," he said, the words feeling clumsy and loud in the humming silence. He didn't know if it could understand him, but the intent had to be clear. He moved to the field's primary control pedestal, his fingers flying across the interface, entering a series of shutdown codes he had long since memorized from tedious maintenance manuals. Each command was a flagrant violation, a digital scream of treason through the station's network. The amber field wavered, then collapsed inward with a soft implosion of light. For the first time, Kalen saw the Xylosian without a filter. She was taller than he had imagined, her body a complex lattice of crystalline structures that refracted the ambient light into 1,000 tiny rainbows. Her limbs were long and graceful, her face a smooth, featureless ovoid from which a soft, internal luminescence shone. She did not look monstrous. She looked magnificent and terribly fragile. She took a hesitant step on the metal deck, her crystalline feet making no sound, and then her legs buckled, her body weakened by years, perhaps decades, of imprisonment and being used as a living battery. He caught her, surprised by the lack of weight. It was like holding an armful of spun glass and cold fire. Her touch sent a jolt through him, and the connection in his mind flared. He saw a flash of a fractured sky, of silver ships burning, of a world not of rock and metal, but of living crystal, now dark and silent. He saw her pain, her loss, her unending grief. The sound of heavy plasma fire impacting the lift door above shattered the moment. They were cutting their way through. He helped her to her feet, his arm around her waist for support. "This way," he urged, pulling her toward a heavy maintenance hatch on the far side of the chamber. It led to the underbelly of the asteroid, the old, forgotten mining tunnels from before Axiom had refitted the station. It was a maze of decay and darkness, but it was their only chance. As he worked the manual release wheel on the heavy hatch, a section of the ceiling exploded inward in a shower of sparks and molten metal. Thorn and two armored guards dropped through the opening, their plasma repeaters already leveled. "Traitor!" Thorn snarled, his face contorted with righteous fury. "You've lost your mind, old man. Stand down." Kalen shoved the Xylosian behind him, raising his antique pistol. It felt like a pitiful gesture against their advanced weaponry. He was a warden, a relic. They were the sharp, brutal edge of corporate power. The fight was over before it began. He braced himself for the searing heat of plasma. But before Thorn could fire, the being behind him moved. She raised a slender, crystalline hand, and a wave of pure white light erupted from her palm. It wasn't an attack, not a blast of energy, but something else entirely. It was a pulse of profound silence and confusion. The guards' targeting systems went haywire, their helmet displays filling with static. Thorn cried out, stumbling back as if struck, his weapon wavering. The pulse had disrupted their tech, but it had also drained her. She sagged against Kalen, the light of her form dimming. He seized the moment. He fired his pistol twice. The heavy slugs were not meant to penetrate their armor, but he wasn't aiming for their chests. He aimed for the weapon mounts. The first shot shattered the plasma coil on one guard's repeater. The second struck Thorn's weapon, sending it spinning from his grasp. It was enough. Kalen spun the wheel on the hatch the final turn, wrenched it open, and pulled the Xylosian through into the oppressive darkness beyond. He slammed the heavy steel door shut just as the guards recovered, their blind plasma shots scoring streaks of molten ruin across its surface. They were in the old tunnels now. The air was stale, cold, and thin. The only light came from the dimming glow of the Xylosian leaning heavily against him. Behind them, he could hear the guards trying to cut through the hatch. They had bought themselves minutes, nothing more. He was a fugitive, allied with a creature he did not understand, hunted by the system he had once served. The exodus had begun. The darkness of the old tunnels was absolute, a physical presence that swallowed sound and light. Kalen guided them by touch, one hand on the cold, weeping rock of the tunnel wall, the other supporting the Xylosian, whose name he now knew, a whisper of light in his mind, was Lyra. She was a dead weight against him now. Her inner luminescence faded to a faint, ghostly glimmer. The pulse of energy she had released had cost her dearly. Distrust radiated from her in cold waves, mingling with her fear and exhaustion. She saw him as just another captor, a different kind of cage. He could feel her skepticism, her belief that he was merely moving her from one prison to another. He found a small service junction, a place where old conduits crisscrossed in a tangled mess of corroded metal. It offered a defensible position, at least for a few moments. He eased Lyra down to sit against a wall, her form slumping with a fragility that seemed at odds with the power he had witnessed. He checked his pistol. 6 rounds left. Against Thorn's squads, it was little more than a noisemaker. Their survival depended on stealth, on vanishing into the forgotten guts of this asteroid. He could hear the distant, methodical sounds of the hunt, the scrape of metal, the sweep of scanner beams cutting through the gloom far down the main corridor, the disciplined radio chatter he could no longer understand, but whose cadence was deeply familiar. Thorn would be relentless. This was more than a security breach for him. It was personal. Kalen had broken the code, the chain of command that Thorn held sacred. Lyra stirred, her featureless face turning toward a branching tunnel to their left. A faint warning pulsed from her, a premonition of danger. Kalen fell silent, straining his ears. At first, he heard nothing. Then, a low, rhythmic whirring, the sound of automated systems still active after decades of neglect. Maintenance drones. Axiom had likely reactivated them remotely. turning the station's own janitorial systems into a search-and-destroy network. 3 of them appeared at the far end of the corridor, their single red optical sensors cutting sharp lines through the darkness. They were squat, spider-like machines, designed for repairs in hazardous environments, but now their manipulator arms were fitted with plasma cutters and industrial clamps, turning them into crude but effective enforcers. They rolled forward on silent, magnetized wheels, their sensors sweeping back and forth. There was no way to fight them, and no way to retreat without running straight into Thorne's patrols. They were pinned. Kalen pushed Lyra deeper into the recess of the junction, shielding her with his body. He raised his pistol, knowing it was useless. The drone's plating was too thick. One of the drones locked onto them, its red eye fixing on their position. It emitted a piercing electronic shriek, an alert to the network, and its plasma cutter began to glow with white-hot intensity. Kalen braced himself, the old instincts screaming, the familiar, cold acceptance of the end settling over him. He would die here, in the dark, defending a being he had met only hours ago. It was a better death than he deserved. As the drone fired, a bolt of incandescent plasma screaming toward them, he threw himself in front of Lyra. The heat was immense, a physical blow. The shot went wide, striking the wall behind him, but a secondary splash of molten energy caught him across his left shoulder. The pain was searing, a sudden, blinding agony that stole his breath. His uniform fused to his skin, and the smell of his own burnt flesh filled the small space. He cried out, stumbling to one knee, his pistol clattering to the floor. He had failed. But as he fell, he saw Lyra move. Her inner light, which had been so faint, suddenly flared with a ferocious, brilliant intensity. She rose to her feet, no longer frail, but radiating a power that seemed to warp the very air around her. She extended both hands, and a focused beam of pure, silver light shot from her palms, striking the lead drone. There was no explosion, no sound of impact. The drone simply ceased to be. Its metal form dissolved into a cloud of glittering dust that hung in the air for a moment before vanishing. The other 2 drones reacted instantly, firing their cutters. Lyra created a shield of shimmering energy in front of her, the plasma bolts splashing harmlessly against it like water against glass. Then she sent out another pulse, not the disorienting wave she had used against the guards, but something far more potent. It was a wave of raw, kinetic force that slammed into the remaining drones, crumpling them like paper and sending them crashing into the far wall, where they fell silent, their red eyes dark. The corridor fell quiet again, the only sound Kalen's own ragged breathing. Lyra's light subsided, her form once again becoming dim and translucent. She swayed, and he saw the effort had drained her almost completely. He pushed himself up, his left arm a useless, burning weight, and retrieved his pistol. He went to her side. She reached out a hesitant, crystalline hand and touched the horrific burn on his shoulder. Her touch was cool, and the blinding pain receded to a dull, manageable ache. In his mind, the cold wall of her distrust was gone. In its place was a new feeling, a complex chord of gratitude, respect, and a shared sense of desperation. He had shielded her with his body. She had saved him with her power. In that moment of mutual protection, their alliance was forged. They were no longer warden and prisoner, master and asset. They were survivors, and they were in this together. The journey through the asteroid's catacombs became a shared ordeal that stretched into a measureless passage of time. The darkness was a constant companion, broken only by Lyra's faint glow, which seemed to wax and wane with her strength. Kalen's burned shoulder was a throbbing metronome marking their slow, painful progress. They moved through vast, silent caverns where colossal mining machinery stood like the skeletons of forgotten leviathans, coated in decades of dust. They navigated treacherous catwalks over chasms of absolute blackness and squeezed through cramped service conduits where the groaning of stressed metal was the only sound. Thorne's patrols were a constant threat, their searchlights periodically lancing through the darkness, forcing Kalen and Lyra to freeze in whatever cover they could find. Communication between them evolved beyond simple feelings. Lyra began to share images, memories, fragments of her story, projecting them directly into Kalen's consciousness. It was a language of pure experience, more potent than any spoken word. He saw her world, a planet of living crystal called Xylos, where her people lived in symbiosis with the planet's energy, shaping it into cities of light and music. They were not warriors. They were artists, gardeners of cosmic energy. As they rested in the shadow of a derelict or hauler, Lyra projected the most painful memory of all, the arrival of the first Axiom ships. They came not with declarations of war, but with offers of trade, their holds filled with wonders. But it was a lie. The Axiom prospectors discovered the planet's secret, that Xylos was not just a planet, but a galactic nexus, a place where the fabric of space-time was thin, a source of almost limitless energy. And they wanted it. The vision she shared was sharp and brutal. He saw Axiom ships opening fire on the crystalline cities, the beautiful structures shattering into dust. He saw her people, who had no concept of such violence, unable to fight back effectively, their defensive energies overwhelmed by the sheer, brute force of corporate armadas. Axiom had manufactured a border skirmish, framed the Xylosians as hostile aggressors, and then launched a full-scale war of extermination under the guise of security. The galaxy, eager for a new villain and a new source of cheap energy, believed the lie. The final piece of the vision slammed into Kalen with the force of a physical blow. He saw the glassing of Cygnus X-1. It had been presented to him and his legion as the final, necessary act to crush the Xylosian menace, to destroy their primary staging ground. But Lyra showed him the truth. Cygnus X-1 had been a refugee world, a place where the few survivors of Xylos had gathered, a planet of no strategic value. Its destruction had not been a military necessity. It had been a massacre, a final, vicious act to erase the Xylosians from history and secure Axiom's claim to the Nexus. He had not been a soldier ending a war. He had been a monster, an executioner of innocence. The guilt he had carried for years, a dull, formless weight, now crystallized into a shard of pure, agonizing shame. He had been Valerius's butcher. He sank to the floor, the truth a poison in his veins. He looked at his hands, the hands that had keyed in the final firing sequence. Lyra knelt beside him, her light soft and sorrowful. She seemed to understand, to feel the echo of his own trauma. She knew he had been there. She had seen it in his mind from the beginning. He finally looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw past the alien form to the person within. He saw the cracks in her crystalline skin, not just injuries from her capture, but scars of grief that mirrored the ones on his own soul. He slowly, hesitantly, reached out his good hand and touched one of the fine fractures on her arm. It felt like cool, smooth glass. Through their connection, he tried to project his own apology, his regret, his shame. It was a clumsy, broken transmission of pure emotion. In response, Lyra raised her hand and gently touched the scarred flesh on his arm, the old burn marks from a plasma burst he'd taken during that same campaign. As her fingers made contact, he felt no judgment from her, no hatred or accusation. He felt only a shared, profound understanding of loss. She had lost her world. He had lost his soul. In that silent, dusty cavern, surrounded by the ghosts of industry, the two survivors found a strange and solemn solace in their shared scars. The bond between them was no longer just about survival. It was about redemption. Their escape could not remain a secret forever. After days spent in the asteroid's depths, they found what they were looking for, a decommissioned comm station, its systems archaic but, with Lyra's ability to coax energy from dead circuits, potentially functional. Kalen's plan was simple: broadcast the truth. Send Lyra's memories, the proof of Axiom's genocide, to the wider galaxy. Expose Valerius and the corporation for what they were. It was a desperate gamble. Axiom's control over interstellar communications was nearly absolute, but even a single, leaked transmission could start a fire. As Lyra interfaced with the ancient console, her light flowing into the circuits like living water, Kalen stood guard. The station was located near a docking bay, and the risk of discovery was high. His instincts screamed that their time was running out. He was right. Before Lyra could establish a stable connection, the blast doors to the comm station were blown inward by a shaped charge, the explosion deafening in the enclosed space. Subprefect Thorne stood in the smoking breach, flanked by a full squad of elite corporate shock troops in heavy black armor. His face was a mask of cold fury. "The game is over, Kalen," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "Prefect Valerius is tired of your insurrection. He has sent me to retrieve the asset and retire you permanently." The battle was short and brutal. Kalen was no match for a dozen trained soldiers, but he was fighting in a confined space he now knew better than they did. He used the environment, toppling gantries and sparking power conduits to create chaos. Lyra was the true force, however. She moved like a phantom, her light form phasing through their clumsy plasma bolts, her touch shorting out their armor's systems, her pulses of force sending them flying. But there were too many of them. For every soldier they disabled, two more seemed to take their place. A stray shot struck the comms console, causing it to explode in a shower of sparks, ending their only hope of contacting the outside world. Valerius had anticipated them. He had been hurting them here. As the last of the shock troops fell, Thorn himself charged forward, a vibroblade humming in his hand. Kalen met his charge, his antique pistol against the energized blade. They fought with a desperate ferocity, a clash between the past and the present. Thorn was younger, faster, but Kalen was more experienced, more ruthless. He used Thorn's aggression against him, sidestepping a lunge and bringing the butt of his pistol down hard on the back of Thorn's helmet. The sub-prefect crumpled to the deck, unconscious. They had won the skirmish, but the larger truth was dawning on Kalen. As he looked out the station's viewport, he saw it. An entire Axiom fleet had translated from hyperspace, a wall of gray, angular warships forming a blockade around Titan's maw. Valerius wasn't just containing a breach anymore. He was preparing to sterilize the entire sector, to erase the asteroid, the evidence, and everyone on it from existence. Their small rebellion had escalated the stakes to an unimaginable degree. They were trapped on a floating tomb with a man who would burn a system to protect his secrets. A direct military victory was not just improbable, it was a fantasy. Defeated, they retreated deeper, finding their way to a derelict hangar bay Kalen remembered from old schematics. It housed a single ship, a relic from the Praetorian era, covered in dust and neglect. It was an old Aegis-class frigate, a ghost of the Republic that Axiom had supplanted. It was their last, desperate hope of escape. As Lyra poured her energy into the ship's cold reactor, coaxing it back to life, the vessel shuddered, ancient systems groaning in protest. Emergency lights flickered on, illuminating a bridge that was a museum of forgotten technology. The main viewscreen activated, showing the terrifying spectacle of the Axiom fleet. They were hopelessly, laughably outgunned. "Power levels at 20%, Kalen said, his voice grim as he read the console. "Life support is stable, but weapon systems are locked. Encrypted. They require a command-level authorization." As he spoke, a beam of blue light emanated from a security scanner on the ceiling, sweeping across the bridge. It passed over Lyra, registering her as an unknown biological entity. Then it passed over Kalen. It lingered on the Praetorian pistol holstered at his hip. The light intensified, focusing on the weapon's grip, where the insignia of the First Legion was faintly engraved. For a long moment, there was only the low hum of the scanner. Then, a new voice spoke, calm and clear, emanating from the ship's own speakers. It was a voice of composed, synthetic intelligence, a voice that had been silent for decades. "Genetic signature and service weapon confirmed," the ship AI announced. "Owner recognized. Praetorian Marshal Kalen. Welcome back, sir. Arsenal unlocked. The Aegis protocol is now active." The ship hummed with new life. On the tactical display, weapon icons switched from red to green. Heavy energy cannons, missile pods, a spinal-mounted particle lance. The full, devastating might of a Republic warship came online. Kalen stared at the console. Praetorian Marshal. It was a rank he had been awarded posthumously, in a sense. A field promotion he never knew he'd received, buried in the chaos of the war's end, erased by Axiom when they seized power. This ship, the Aegis, had been his assigned command. A command he had never taken. For a fleeting moment, hope surged through him. With this ship, they could fight. They could make them pay. But as he looked at the dozens of Axiom cruisers, he knew it was still not enough. They could inflict damage, they could take some of them down, but they would be overwhelmed. They could fight a glorious, pointless battle and die. It was then that Lyra touched his arm, her thoughts flowing into his, clear and terrible. She showed him the nexus again, the heart of power at the center of the asteroid, now directly connected to Valerius's command center. She showed him that it could not be destroyed, only sealed. To do so required a guardian, a consciousness to merge with it, to pull it out of physical space and become its eternal warden. The ritual required two components, a xylosion to open the way, and a human mind, with its unique capacity for structured chaos and individuality, to serve as the final anchor. It was a permanent transformation, a sacrifice. One of them had to become the key, the lock, and the prison, all at once. The impossible choice was presented, stark and absolute. Win the battle and lose the war, or one of them could sacrifice everything to end it for good. The hum of the Aegis's awakened systems was a low, powerful thrum that vibrated through the deck plates, a song of forgotten power. For a moment, Kalen allowed himself to believe in it. He could unleash this ship's fury, a final, defiant act against the corporation that had stolen his life and destroyed Lyra's world. He could die in a blaze of glory, a soldier's death. It was the ending he had always imagined for himself, the only one that seemed fitting for a man made of wreckage and regret. He stood on the bridge, his hand resting on the cold metal of the command console, and looked at the tactical display. The Axiom fleet was a swarm of angry red icons. His ship was a single point of defiant blue. A hopeless fight, but a fight nonetheless. It was the soldier's way, the simple, clean logic of violence. But then he looked at Lyra. She stood by the viewport, her form shimmering softly, her gaze fixed on the distant, silent stars that had once been her home. He felt the immense weight of her people's memory, the silent grief of a billion extinguished souls. A blaze of glory would not bring them back. A soldier's death would be a final, selfish act, an easy escape from the true weight of his sins. It would be an abdication of the responsibility he now felt, a responsibility not to fight, but to build, to heal, to ensure no one ever had to suffer as she had. The choice Lyra had presented to him echoed in the silence of his mind. One of them had to become the seal, a permanent guardian for the Nexus. It was a fate worse than death, an eternity of conscious isolation, a dissolution of self into a living concept. It was the antithesis of a soldier's end. It was not a glorious death, but a quiet, eternal duty. It was a warden's duty. The irony was so profound it was almost beautiful. He had spent years as a warden for a single prisoner in a metal cage. Now, he had the chance to become the warden of a cosmic power, to cage a source of endless war. He walked away from the command console and stood beside her at the viewport. He did not look at the enemy fleet, but at the reflection of his own face in the reinforced glass. He saw the lines of weariness, the old scars, the hollowness in his eyes. He had lived his life in service to corrupt orders and broken codes. He had followed a path of destruction that had led him here, to this final crossroad. One path led to a meaningless, violent end. The other led to atonement. It was a chance to finally give his life a meaning that transcended killing. It was a chance to save her, and in saving her, to save the last, tattered remnant of his own humanity. The internal conflict, the last battle of his life, was over. There was no grand revelation, no sudden surge of heroism. There was only a quiet, solemn acceptance, a sense of grim, inevitable purpose settling into the spaces where his despair had lived. This was how his war ended. Not with a bang, but with a silent vow. He turned to Lyra. She looked at him, her featureless face somehow conveying an expression of deep, knowing sorrow. She knew what he was about to decide. He reached out his good hand, not to the ship's controls, but to her. He placed his palm gently over the fine, crystalline crack on her arm, the scar that mirrored his own. Through their link, he sent not a thought, but a single, unwavering feeling, a sense of finality, of peace, of commitment. I will do it. Lyra did not try to dissuade him. She understood sacrifice better than anyone. Her light pulsed, a soft, mournful wave of deep blue and violet. It was a color of acceptance, of immense gratitude, and of the profound sorrow of a farewell that would last for eternity. In that silent moment on the bridge of the forgotten warship, the reluctant savior accepted his fate. His final order to himself had been given. Take us in. Kalen's voice was steady, cutting through the hum of the bridge. Straight for the command spire. Use the Aegis as a battering ram. Lyra nodded, her form now glowing with a brilliant, determined light. She became one with the ship, her energy flowing through its systems, her consciousness guiding it with a precision no mortal pilot could match. The Aegis surged forward, its powerful engines igniting for the first time in a generation. It accelerated with impossible speed, a silver spear aimed at the heart of Valerius's operation. The Axiom fleet reacted, swarming toward them, unleashing a storm of plasma and laser fire. Shields flared around the Aegis, shimmering curtains of emerald energy that absorbed the onslaught. The Old Republic warship was more than a match for their modern, mass-produced cruisers. Kalen watched as Lyra orchestrated their defense and offense, particle lances cutting through Axiom ships, missiles finding their targets with unerring accuracy. It was a beautiful, terrible dance of destruction, but it was only a distraction. They broke through the outer screen of warships, the command spire of Titan's maw now looming in the viewport, a jagged tooth of metal and rock. Alarms blared across the bridge as hull breaches were reported, as systems began to fail under the relentless barrage. The Aegis was dying, but it would complete its final mission. With a final, terrifying surge of power, the ship crashed into the spire. The impact was cataclysmic. Metal screamed and tore, decks buckled, and the world dissolved into a chaotic symphony of destruction. The ship's momentum carried it deep into the station's structure before it finally ground to a halt, a broken wedge of metal buried in the ruins of Valerius's headquarters. In the sudden, ringing silence, Kalen pushed himself up from the deck. His body was a tapestry of new pains, but he was alive. Lyra's light was dim, the effort having taken a massive toll. The Nexus chamber, he rasped, is below the prefect's throne room. They fought their way through the wreckage, a two-person army against the chaos. The station's internal defenses were in shambles, but pockets of resistance remained. They were confronted by the last of the station's security, but in the close confines of the ruined corridors, Kalen's brutal efficiency and Lyra's ethereal power were unstoppable. They finally reached the throne room. It was a wreck of shattered obsidian and sparking consoles. In the center of the room, standing over the bleeding form of an aide, was Sub-Prefect Thorn. His armor was battered, his face smeared with blood and soot, but his eyes burned with a fanatic's zeal. "You will not defile this place, traitor," he roared, activating his vibroblade. The final confrontation was not a noble duel. It was a desperate, ugly brawl amidst the ruins. Thorn was fueled by rage, but Kalen was driven by a purpose that had eclipsed his own life. He took a deep cut to his leg, another to his ribs, but he did not fall. He saw an opening, a moment of overreach in Thorn's attack, and he drove his shoulder into the man's chest, sending them both crashing through the weakened railing behind the prefect's dais. They fell to a service catwalk below. Kalen's head struck metal, and the world swam in a haze of red. Thorn was on him in an instant, the humming blade descending toward his throat. Kalen had just enough strength left to grab Thorn's arm, to turn the man's own momentum against him. He twisted, and the vibroblade, instead of finding his neck, plunged into a thick power conduit running along the wall. Thorn screamed as a torrent of raw energy coursed through the blade and into his body. He convulsed once, then fell still, his obsession finally extinguished. Kalen, bleeding from a dozen wounds, pulled himself back to his feet and staggered toward the Nexus chamber. Lyra was there, waiting for him, holding the way open. The chamber was a sphere of raw, swirling energy, the Nexus itself a chaotic storm of light and color at its center. And before it stood Prefect Valerius, his pristine uniform now torn and stained, trying desperately to activate a containment device to harness the power for himself. "You cannot stop progress," Valerius snarled, raising a plasma pistol. "This isn't progress," Kalen said, his voice a weary whisper. "It's theft." He charged, a final, desperate act. Valerius fired, the plasma bolt catching Kalen in the chest. The pain was absolute, a fire that consumed everything. But his momentum carried him forward. He tackled Valerius, his arms locking around the prefect in an unbreakable grip. "Now, Lyra. Do it now," he yelled, his lifeblood pouring onto the deck. He dragged the screaming, struggling Valerius with him, stumbling into the heart of the nexus. Lyra raised her hands, her form exploding into a sun of pure, white light. The light enveloped Kalen and Valerius. He felt no pain, only a profound sense of release. His body, his wounds, his past, it all dissolved. His consciousness expanded, spreading out, becoming infinite. He was no longer Kalen, the broken soldier. He was a thought, a will, a silent, eternal watchman. He felt Lyra's presence with him, a comforting warmth, as they wove the final threads of the seal. His last sensation was one of profound peace, the quiet satisfaction of a duty finally, truly, done. From the outside, the effect was instantaneous. The swirling vortex of energy at the heart of Titan's maw simply vanished. The strange radiation that Axiom had been mining, the life force of the Xylosians, winked out of existence across the galaxy. On the decks of the Axiom fleet, consoles went dark, weapon systems powered down, and engines fell silent as their primary energy source disappeared. The war, a conflict built on a foundation of stolen power, stopped. Not with a treaty, not with a surrender, but with a sudden, baffling, and absolute silence. The casus belli was gone. The prize no longer existed. The fleet was left adrift, a powerless monument to a dead corporation's greed. 10 years passed. The silence that had fallen over the Axiom fleet had spread across the galaxy. The corporation, deprived of its energy monopoly and exposed by fragmented data recovered from the Aegis's black box, had collapsed under the weight of its own corruption. The old republic, slowly, painstakingly, was being reborn from the ashes, its ideals of cooperation and justice no longer sounding like naive relics of a bygone era. The Xylosians had returned. Led by Lyra, they emerged from their hidden enclaves, their worlds now safe. They were not vengeful. They brought with them their knowledge, their ability to harmonize with natural energy sources, helping to wean the recovering galaxy off the rapacious technologies of the past. They taught others how to listen to the stars instead of merely consuming them. A new age of quiet, sustainable progress had begun. On a terraformed moon orbiting a world once slated for Axiom exploitation, a place of green hills and clear, placid lakes, stood a monument. It was not a grand statue of a conquering hero or a triumphant soldier. It was a simple, elegant column of pure black obsidian, set in a field of softly glowing moon lilies. The stone seemed to drink the light of the nearby star, its surface a perfect, unreflective void. It was a place of quiet contemplation, a memorial to the costly peace. Lyra often came here. She looked almost human now, having learned to shape her light into a more solid, stable form, though her eyes still held the shimmering depth of a starfield. She walked to the base of the obsidian column and placed her hand flat against its cool, smooth surface. She closed her eyes, and for a long moment, she simply stood in silence, remembering. The surface of the obsidian remained dark, but deep within its core, a faint constellation of light shimmered into existence. It was a familiar pattern, a consciousness she knew as well as her own. It was Kalen. He was not trapped, not suffering. He was at peace, his awareness a silent, unwavering guard over the gateway he had sealed. He was the warden, the eternal sentinel ensuring the Nexus would never again be used as a weapon. His sacrifice had not been an end, but a transformation into a symbol of enduring vigilance. He could not speak, but she could feel him. She could feel his quiet strength, his acceptance, his unending watch. He was the anchor that held their new reality in place. He was the ghost in the foundation of their peace, the soldier who had laid down his gun to become a shield. His name was not taught in history lessons, and no songs were sung of his final battle. His was a quieter legacy, written in the silence between the stars. Lyra opened her eyes, a single, crystalline tear tracing a path down her cheek before evaporating into a mote of light. She took her hand from the monument, the constellation within its depths fading back into the darkness. His sacrifice was not forgotten. She would remember. She would ensure this peace, the peace he had purchased with his own soul, would last for 10,000 years. The story ended, as it had begun, in a profound and meaningful silence.